Former Trump national security advisor urges resumption of nuclear testing. Robert O'Brien says the U.S. should abandon moratorium, but experts say proposal would hasten global nuclear arms race. So Robert O'Brien was last national security advisor under Donald Trump and widely tipped to play a leading role in a second presidency. This man is absolutely. Washington must test nuclear weapons for reliability and safety in the real world for the first time since 1992, not just by using computer models. Also, said that we need to. It's not here in this one. I read it in a different angry that I can't find the quote. This is specifically about the arms race. But beyond just live testing of nuclear weapons, he specifically said in the Pacific, which would likely be Bikini Atoll because that's where to test nuclear weapons. It's very close to China. He said we need to lessen our diplomatic ties with China and then do this. As if this would in any way lead to anything positive. This is essentially just warmongering. If implemented, his strategy of less diplomacy with China and then live testing of nuclear weapons for the first time since the 90s in a place that's close to China, who we already have a tense relationship with, that we have now, in this case, made tenser, is not going to lead to anything positive and is just batshit crazy. And speaking of beyond that, the Chinese premier, number 2, basically, under Xi Jinping. Yeah, President number 2 has been Australia. This is the first time, highest ranking official China in 7 years. Came to Adelaide, talked about pandas, but more importantly, toured Australia and talked about tariffs, trade war stuff, and buying rights to mining natural resources. Now, you might already know that China owns most of the world's cobalt mines, located primarily in Africa. Cobalt is an incredibly important mineral for electric vehicles. Now, China has an elsewhere, but Australia and China had not the best relations for the last year. Crippling tariffs were lifted in March that China had placed that cost Australian total about $790 million a year since 2020. Now, tariffs were put in place, yes, over lobster. Stupid trade war. What's more important is the diplomatic ties between China and Australian media. The news is primarily owned by News Corp, which is the Murdoch media, Fox News. And a lot of the news that you see in Australia that most people would watch on television, old school, legacy, talk about China in a way that's very, they're going to get you, they're getting ready, like we're going to have a war, Australia has increased its military budget and has put more of a distinction on navy rather than its army it had before. He entered the AUKUS trade deal, not the trade deal, the AUKUS deal with the United States to give us nuclear powered submarines on behalf of the United States. There's Pine Gap, it monitor the Middle East, China, generally. Five Eyes, which Australia, Canada, the US, the UK, France, I believe. Most of that information comes from Australia. Well, from a geosynchronous satellite that beams its information directly to. It's not a bad thing that uh, their premier and tried to reset diplomatic ties because things were going in very negative direction. And as much as the media says so, China does not want to war with America, with the West. They want Taiwan, but they don't want a war against the West. And that wouldn't really happen anyway. It would benefit neither party because our economies are so entangled with one another that regardless of who wins or who starts this crisis, this war between even just America and China, let alone the entirety of the West, will affect the entire world in an incredibly negative way. Which is partially why we're trying to decouple our economy from them so that that's less of a problem in case they do decide to invade Taiwan or because US military industrial complex wants one or the other, maybe both. But it's important that relations are trying to be by some of these. Um, Relations tumbled over legislation that would ban foreign interference in Australian politics, the exclusion of a Chinese-owned telecommunications giant, um, Huawei, from rolling out national 5G network security concerns, and Australia's call for an independent investigation into the causes and response to COVID-19. Now, again, a lot of this legislation comes from this was last year. It comes from the rhetoric of the United States around TikTok and other Chinese is really mostly trade wars. COVID-19, that was a lot of these are minor nitpicks that don't actually affect policy, but make the news because they're clickbait. And regardless of the US or Australia or the UK or China, our governments all use these to enact policies that further their goals in ways that aren't exactly outlined by the broader policy itself, but are more detailed within the policy and side effects that it produces. In response to this, the tariffs and trade blocks Beijing put on Australia included coal, wine, beef, barley, and wood, which is really the majority of Australian exports. I would say I could put wool in here and real estate, but coal is coal and wine and are really big industry. And that tariff, that block of trade really did hurt with the amount of money. That's good that that's now been lifted. Again, I say that having an economy that is coupled with the globe, a globalist economy, is probably best motivator to avoid conflict. It better than your weapons, I'd say, because yes, the destruction of the planet dying is obviously a pretty big God, I'm losing the word here. Incentive to not start a war. However, you nuclear armed nations still have wars without using their nukes. Haven't had two nuclear armed nations go to war against each other. Hope we don't anytime soon, because I don't trust any of the leaders of nuclear armed nations at the moment, not use them. But even a more present and tangible incentive to not have a war is financial ruin. That is, like, global nuclear destruction is a hypothetical thought that can be put aside, whereas directly harming yourself, your donors, your companies, and your citizens financially, which will affect you negatively as a politician or the leader of a country in the long run, is just it seems to be less worth it and less ignorable of a concept than Foreign Minister Penny Wong said these it was the result of 2 years of very deliberate, very patient work by this government. Blah, cooperate where we can, disagree. Wong said before joining Adelaide's home to a China-born home to Jesus. Hold on. Let's try that again. Adelaide Zoo, which has been home to China-born giant pandas. China-born giant pandas. I don't know why that's so hard to say. Wang Wang and Fu 2009. Lee announced that the zoo would be loaned another two pandas after the pair are due to return to China in November. Some light diplomacy there. Obviously, pandas, cool, are important here. Yes, pandas are good for the zoo star attraction is good for the economy, tourism in South Australia, jobs. But one of the yes, there was protests outside of the from activists who China among the protesters, Hong Kong lawmaker 3 years ago. Activism, great, love that. Love to see human rights protesters and democracy activists gathered to call out China's premier. However, telling me, but very, very, very large of the reason that China came here, the premier of China, and did this countrywide tour of visiting all the states and wants to buy or rent visit to Australia, which begins Sunday, is the first by a Chinese premier. Here's a market, while China has largely tried all of this, issue of how Australia screens Chinese investment in the critical minerals sector, expected to be discussed at a business roundtable in Perth attended by Lee, Australian Prime Minister Anthony. Critical minerals, including rare earth minerals, have become an area of intense competition between China and the US, which sees Australia's deposits as a way to break China's stranglehold over global supply. Again, hoping Reuters happen. All of the different rare earth minerals that China operates. Biggest rare earth company outside of China. Challenges. No matter. It is commonly known. Currently, most of these are mined by China. Now, Australia last month blocked several Chinese investors from increasing stakes in uh, a rare earth miner on national grounds, and last year blocked the acquisition of a lithium mine by Chinese. The U.S. this year extended its support for the first time back to Australian-listed rare earth projects to help build out the supply chain. Lee said on Monday that China hoped Australia would provide a, quote, fair, just, and non-discriminatory business environment for Chinese enterprises. Quote, hold the business roundtable that countries benefit from each other's development. China wants more mines. Australian executives said that for quarters of Australian exports to China come from Australia, by Albanese. He also said that his government wants to create jobs in critical mining processing, refining, and manufacturing, and sell to a broader range of markets. Now, a little bit off topic here. I think that's really important. Much of Australia's exports are unrefined goods and commodities. It's ridiculous to me that mining is such a huge part of the Australian economy, yet there isn't a metal foundry built next to half the mines in the country to produce steel, for example, like the thing they're mining, and sell that rather than the raw goods. Don't have really any. Don't have an international industry of manufacturing like that in Australia, and it's kind of ridiculous. But that's a side tangent. Australia said last month it would consider Chinese ownership when deciding whether companies qualify for tax credits under a new program of incentive supports for the critical mining sector. I'm sorry. Ahead of the roundtable, Lee toured a lithium hydroxide processing plant owned by Tianqi Lithium Energy. Australia, 51% owned by Shenzhen, and Hong Kong listed Tianqi 49% by Australian miner IPO, during whether will more than double production. Tianqi Lithium chief executive Frank Ha told the Australian Financial Today that the company had not sought incentives, but that they were on the table. They wanted to give it a go. I think normalizing relations with China is a good thing, a beneficial thing. I don't think doing so by selling them the mineral that is Australia should mining, processing, manufacturing, and selling. I don't like that. I did want to know how the Australian media is reacting to what they're saying. Let's have a look-see. This is from 9 News.
Yesterday, handshakes. Today, hard hats, as China's premier jetted across the country to Australia's mining heartland. Precious minerals, not pandas, on the agenda as the world bets big on batteries.
Against a skyline built by money from mining, the Prime Minister and Premier, the Chinese counterpart, given a new title.
I acknowledge my friend Premier Lee. You are so welcome.
This first major visit in 7 years.
Obviously, calling him a friend is appreciate.
helping restore relations between leaders and with Australian business.
Whatever the issue, it is always better if we deal direct with each other.
There are 1 in 4 Australian jobs that are trade dependent. We'd like to see more opportunities for trade because that supports, it cements and secures jobs for Australians.
This doesn't look necessarily good for the government because they're so focused on trade laws, which say to me that they just want to sell these minerals. They want to take the money, whether their allies like the US want them to or not. Whether this is actually going to happen or not is another question. But there isn't enough of an emphasis on manufacturing, keeping a portion of the supply of rare earth minerals under the control of somebody that doesn't already control most of the supply. It doesn't matter whether it's China. It's America who controlled most of the world's supply. And China was trying to either mine some of their own or buy some land too much different. Like, I would be for the Chinese government doing it in that case. It's not a matter of who, it's more of a matter of one government, one state not have this much control of a precious mineral that is important to not only electric vehicles, but a lot of different technologies, and will be important
Here at home.
Earlier, in a suit and hard hat, China's second most powerful man touring Australia's second largest export to China, lithium. China imports roughly 95% of Australia's lithium, worth around $12 billion a year to our economy, a vital cog in the $320 billion two-way trade. Lithium is crucial in the production of batteries and electric cars, two industries dominated by China.
This is an important opportunity for us to demonstrate that we can not only mine
Production of battery.
That's crazy. Yes, that's $320 billion of trade. However, produce something with that and then sell it. That's better.
And electric cars.
kind and manufacture.
Last year, the Prime Minister finished
Kind to demonstrate that we can not only mine, we can process, refine and manufacture.
Last year, the Prime Minister finished his trip to Shanghai with lobster in hand. Tonight, lobster producers finished this trip with little to show, but an expectation. The tariffs imposed by Beijing.
Producers, those involved.
Here's Peter Dutton for the non-Australians. Peter Dutton
Australian.
is currently leader of the opposition party, the Liberals, who are essentially Australia's version of Republicans. He has been campaigning hard against Labor, against Albanese. And a lot of the stuff he says is either horrific or pretty sus, at the very least.
Manufacturers, producers, those involved in the agricultural sector shouldn't be paying a price.
When Premier Lee
Producers and manufacturers, specifically in the agricultural sector, not in mining and foundry.
arrived in Australia, he declared the relationship was back on track. But as he leaves, it will be China's actions in the Taiwan.
Now this is Sky News, which is a Murdoch organization, Sky News Corp. Very right wing. Sky News is probably closest to Fox News have, and is generally pretty horrific. Won't watch this whole video, but because I haven't watched these. Get an understanding of how the media sees them, but also show you.
Joining me now is the Australian's Foreign Affairs editor, Greg Sheridan. Greg, good to see you. Anthony Albanese would rather focus on the nice stories when it comes to China and this visit, yet we have seen these clashes today. Do you think that the Prime Minister cares about the human rights abuse issues when he's...
They absolutely do not care about human rights issues. They just want to make the Labour Party, by extension, the Prime Minister Albanese, look bad. The nice, obviously, there's going to be soft diplomacy to start off after 7 years of happening. Like already right off the bat, we're 18 seconds in, and this is fairly new.
Trying to woo Premier Lee.
Well, Danica, great to be with you. I'd give the Albanese government a mixed report. I thought Penny Wong was quite sensible on Insiders on Sunday, listing some of the things we disagree with China about, and very importantly, saying we're in permanent strategic competition with China in the South Pacific. I think this big panda diplomacy visit is all about trying to reset China in the Australian public mind as a sweet and cuddly thing, whereas it's not a sweet and cuddly thing. It's a vicious, brutal, totalitarian dictatorship.
A vicious, brutal, totalitarian dictatorship. Now, China is absolutely a dictatorship. I don't think that it meets the definition totalitarian. Terms are often interchangeably, but they are not the same. A system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state. How would you subservience? Obey unquestioning. You're not allowed to protest certain things. Say certain things. There's a lot of censorship. There's a lot of human rights abuse. But I don't necessarily think that all billion Chinese citizens, billion plus, have to completely obey everything that the state says or does. Like, there can be no dissent. There can be no argument whether something is being done wrong, no advocacy for change. I don't think that China's definition for totalitarianism. But again, the words that this man used are meant to scare you.
Totalitarian dictatorship. A sweet and cuddly thing. It's a vicious, brutal, totalitarian dictatorship.
Vicious, brutal, totalitarian dictatorship. Words that are meant to elicit feelings of anger, fear, or disgust. And bias, in a way. This isn't normal political language.
And I think in several key ways the Prime Minister has
This isn't reporting the. This is giving your own personal.
Formed in this visit very, very significantly. First of all, the demonstrators. No other embassy in Canberra can organise busloads of demonstrators to intimidate and influence Australian politics. That's inconsistent with diplomatic practice. Imagine if the Australian embassy in Beijing tried it for a single second. Now, governments of both.
That is misleading. There were protests and counter-protests. I'd have to see some evidence that the counter-protests were specifically organized to intimidate. I wouldn't put it past China, but I've not seen any evidence of that statement. It's misleading at best.
Pusillanimity of Australian governments that they won't restrict the Chinese embassy to behaving like an embassy, which doesn't include organising busloads of demonstrators and doesn't include manhandling Australian reporters in our own parliament.
Well, I just think it's extraordinary, as you said, that this has happened on Australian soil when we have an open and free Australian press in a democratic nation. Do you think that, in fact, the Prime Minister needs to raise this with the Chinese Premier?
Caused them physical injury. He still won't tell us, the Prime Minister, whether he raised that with Xi Jinping, which probably means he didn't raise it because he had fired sonars at Australian naval divers and caused them...
So this is entirely unrelated to the visit. This is stuff that's been happening in the South China Sea. There have been a lot of close calls between the Australian Air Force and Navy with the Chinese Air Force and Navy. There's been allegations of lasers being pointed at ships, which has been happening all over the South China Sea. There's been really close flybys with planes, and obviously, like he said, the incident with flares. This is all true, but bringing it up in this manner and talking about this visit, like, it's not inappropriate. It's just the way that they're going about it. What's the
physical injury?
Sorry.
He still won't tell us, the Prime...
They're using this to back up their claim that China is vicious and evil, rather than this is a concern that needs to be addressed. They're saying both. That makes sense.
Prime Minister, whether he raised that with Xi Jinping, which probably means he didn't raise it because there'd be no reason not to tell us. But then he had a press conference but made sure that Canberra didn't release the information about this incident until after the press conference was over. Well, this kind of sort of pathetic timidity, it's unbecoming. I mean, Albo, I've got a lot of admiration. I think he's a good bloke, but this is unbecoming.
Wildly.
Behaviour, even on our own soil.
Absolutely. They're trying to appease China. Are you kidding me? Australia has had issues with China, economic ones, due to its protectionist policies that it's been introduced because of the United States. China has had a problem with this and has majorly affected Australia's economy by placing sanctions and blocking trade and adding tariffs. Not the sanctions, but the blocking trade and adding tariffs to certain goods. And this had an immense effect on the Australian economy. Obviously, Albanese wants to appease China, but also not give them everything and not piss off America. Ridiculous that it's being presented in a way that the strategy of appeasement is suspicious and weak and negative in a way that it isn't being done correctly. This is a ridiculous allegation.
Well, that's an overreaction. It's too defensive. It's too...
The allegation is true. It's a ridiculous framing.
Timid.
But I just think that there needs to be more of a stand up for Australian values by this government. I mean, there's been so many incidents as I went to earlier in my editorial. But look, I just want to ask you about climate, because you've written in The Australian today that the oil, gas and coal boom have shattered this decarbonisation myth. Now, we hear it all the time, Greg, that the climate wars, that they have been sparked, particularly ahead of the next election. But you don't actually think that is the case. Why?
Well, climate is contentious all over the world, except most of the world is not nearly as obsessed about it as we are. I mean, it's hardly figuring in the American...
Obsessed about? I'm sorry, I didn't realize you guys weren't watching. There wasn't really much image besides this.